Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Will Pomeranz, and I am the acting director of the Kennan Institute. Thank you for joining us today as we reflect on the 4-month mark in Russia's war in Ukraine and assess the effect of U.S. support. Before I begin, I want to encourage you to stay up to date on the latest Kennan Institute events and publications by visiting our website and subscribing to our two blogs, Focus Ukraine and The Russia File, as well as our podcasts, Kennan X and The Russia File. Also visit our Hindsight Upfront Ukraine collection on the Wilson Center website for the latest news and analysis focused on Ukraine. Today, if you have any questions for our speaker, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom rather than raising your hand. We will be monitoring the Q&A throughout the event, and we'll move to your questions following the presentation. But let me begin by introducing Volodymyr Dubovyk. He is an associate professor at the Department of International Relations and director of the Center for International Studies at Mechnikov National University in Ukraine. He has conducted research as a Fulbright Scholar at the Kennan Institute, as well as at the Center for International and Security Studies at the University of Maryland. He's also taught at the University of Washington. He is the author of numerous articles on U.S.-Ukrainian relations and regional and international security and Ukraine's foreign policy. And in addition to being an alumnus of the Kennan Institute, Dr. Dubovyk is also a recipient of one of our Kennan Institute emergency support grants that we have set up to support scholars in Ukraine during this crisis. So, Volodymyr, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Will. Thank you so much for this very kind introduction. It gives me a very special feeling just to see you sitting in that gallery dedicated to the President Wilson, through which I went so many times. I've been a fellow Kennan twice actually in the past, and the first time was back in '97. The Kennan was still at a different building at that point of time, but then of course another one was in Fulbright as well, Kennan/Fulbright grant, and I was there in this beautiful building. And I have very fond memories of my time in Kennan, and of course I've always been very cherishing this belonging to this family and community of Kennan alumni. So thank you for putting this talk together and chairing it, and for everyone who was involved, Victoria and others, in putting it together, logistics of it. And more thanks, as you mentioned, I have been one of the recipients of this Kennan emergency Ukraine grants. There've been 15 of ours, and it's my honor and privilege to be working with Kennan in this difficult time. And I think it tells a lot about this timely initiative by Kennan Institute to support us scholars in Ukraine of Ukraine at a difficult time. Some are refugees, some are internally displaced persons, others working at home, but still in very difficult circumstances and strenuous situation. So this help is very much timely and very much appreciated. Now, as a topic of my research under this grant actually is U.S.-Ukraine relations, and there is so much to study here. There's so much to look, and every day we're finding more and more information about what's going on in now bilateral relations. There is so much to track, and as always, it's very dynamic. So there is something which is in the back already, a retrospective look. Might not hurt, because a lot of things that are happening today are actually been coming up or kind of building up to what we're having today in the previous several years. What's happening today is obviously very important, and also trying to look beyond what's happening today, because today it's exactly the 4 months of the start of this war of Russia on Ukraine, but we're trying to see what's going to happen in U.S.-Ukraine relations in the coming months and years, and maybe even beyond this war, because there will be Ukraine and there will be U.S. in the future, and we'll be working together, that's for sure. Let me start by saying a few things about what happened in previous years, very briefly, because it helps us I think to move on and informs our discussion of what's happening today since February 24th. Obviously, we have relations for 30 plus years now, predominantly partnering relations, positive relations with very few exceptions when our relations were kind of down and sometimes even negative or frozen, but mostly very good partnering relations. The new period in them started back in 2014 with the start of Russian aggression. And of course, we shouldn't ever forget that what happened on February 24th wasn't the start of Russian war against Ukraine, but was an escalation, a dramatic escalation of the scale of that war, because the war was actually in place since February and then later spring of 2014. In Ukraine, here we always appreciated American support, even though a lot of people here in Ukraine tended to think that not much of toughness towards Russia was in place, displayed by Washington since 2014, and maybe more of support wasn't called for again since spring of 2014. For instance, we didn't have any weapons supply all the way up to 2018. Surprisingly, yes, to a lot of people, it was a Trump administration who decided finally to provide us with some little weapons. Of course, obviously, there was some military and security assistance coming from the American side to Ukraine before that, but not the little weapons. And the average support was coming at the ballpark figure of $250 million a year. That's only security defense assistance. Of course, obviously there was much more that was sent to help Ukraine in these difficult times. Then 2019 was an interesting time, of course. It was a Trump pressure on Kyiv. This is important to understand the current relations in some ways, because Zelensky, our president, was at that point of time only coming to become a president. He was only fresh and, kind of a rookie and very inexperienced in many ways. And the first thing he encountered in dealing with Washington was this pressure from Trump and his inner circle, not from US administration as such, but from President Trump. And we all remember that, the pressure, the freezing of security assistance, the blow up of this information, and then hearings on impeachment, and actually an impeachment by the lower chamber of the Congress. It left certain trauma, I would argue, here in Kyiv, in Ukraine, and trauma in terms of bilateral relations. Never before Ukraine was put in a situation when Americans were not really doing something that would be helping Ukraine or helping American interests, but helping certain people, to meet their political ends and goals. So that was new. And that generated certain background of distrust, I think, in our bilateral relations, and that's unfortunate. And also, for a certain period of time, Ukrainian direction or Ukrainian dimension of U.S. foreign policy has become a little toxic. Not too much of initiative. Both parties in the Congress continue to support Ukraine, but didn't take any bold initiatives ever since on helping Ukraine, on creating different formats, new formats of helping Ukraine. Also, from this administration, the Biden administration, when he came to power about a year ago, that the expectations here in Ukraine were probably unrealistic, too high. But then none of this materialized. There was more of what some experts call benign neglect. I tend to disagree. I don't like the word neglect, but Ukraine wasn't seen as a priority, at least until spring of 2021. When the first Russian accumulation of forces in Ukraine's borders happened. And then now we know that was a time when in the White House was created this kind of a team, and actually several teams, that were monitoring what Russians are doing and trying to do and planning to do. And ever since the focus was on those troops, ever since a year ago, more than a year ago, the spring of 2021. In bilateral relations, there was some disconnect, nothing new really, frankly, in bilateral relations. For Ukrainian leaders, they always valued primarily security assistance. On the American side, this was a priority as well, but also reforms in corruption and fighting against corruption were priorities too. And specifically for this administration, chaired by someone who for 8 years being a vice president was specifically a point person on dealing exactly with this kind of issues, pushing Ukraine to do more reforms and fight corruption. So there was some disconnect here, maybe some annoyance on Ukrainian side, and American side as well. And the early signals were not very, positive because they were delayed. And the delayed call Biden to congratulate Zelensky, then delayed visits until the late spring, if I'm not mistaken, was a Blinken visit to Kyiv. And then there was actually a visit that Zelensky always wanted to have to Washington. He got one in the late summer and early fall of 2021. Relations kind of picked up in pace and in essence and contents as well. But we had a strategic partnership renewed. There was more security assistance, but there were also signs of Ukraine maybe not seen as an urgent matter to attend to in Washington, because the position of special representative, which once was filled by Kurt Walker, remained vacant actually, despite the calls from Hill to fill it was another person, a new person in charge. There was no permanent quotation marks ambassador. There was someone who was in charge, and a good job was done by people who took care of the embassy in Kyiv. But for 3 years now, until quite recently, a couple of weeks ago, Ambassador Bridget Brink coming to Kyiv as a plenipotentiary ambassador. There were no such ambassador here in Kyiv, and a lot of people were kind of upset and saw it as a manifestation of how Washington sees Ukraine as a little bit misbehaving, a little bit not urgent, definitely not something which is worthy of doing something right now. Prior to February 24th, that's an interesting period, so several months, at least since the end of October of 2021. It still remains for us to see, and we are seeing little bits here and there on communications between Kyiv and Washington, and who said what to who and when, and that's important because what evidence was shown by US, for instance, to Kyiv to convince them that Russia is seriously preparing for a massive invasion. It wasn't convincing enough, apparently, to a lot of leaders, including President Zelensky. It all culminated in just briefly days before February 24th. Really was a big press conference, memorable event when Zelensky was speaking, and was kind of publicly surprised and annoyed with Americans saying about the imminent aggression is coming on, and why would they say this? That destabilize the Ukrainian economy and so on. And in terms of chemistry between two leaders, a lot of people tend to ask. Well, I don't see any special positive chemistry between Biden and Zelensky, frankly, but nothing like a negative type either. So there is some kind of business-like relationship. They talk a lot, actually, and President Biden, I think just another day, he mentioned that he talks several times a week with Zelensky, and not even all calls are reflected or reported to the press. But there was a lot of chemistry, obviously, before February 24th, and of course, since on various other levels, because, for instance, on the level of Department of State, there's a good chemistry between Mr. Blinken and his counterparts here in Kyiv, including our foreign minister. Even more so, maybe on the level of Department of Defense, Pentagon, too, Ukrainian chiefs of defense, including Minister Reznikov. There is a lot of good chemistry here, and that's meaningful, very meaningful these days, this last 4 months, when we are working together in this field of defense, and we need to share a lot of information and work together on a daily basis, basically 24/7. So again, before February 24th, how much preparation was there? Both sides a little bitter to each other, I think, because Ukrainians were upset about okay, if you think Russia is preparing an invasion, why don't you introduce some sanctions already? Why are you waiting for them to invade? And Zelensky publicly vented his frustration on that account. In terms of coalition of the countries to support Ukraine and actually put sanctions on Russia, that was a positive experience because Americans were working for months diligently, spending lots of time and resources, human resources, and was working with Europeans and putting the sanctions regime together. So when the invasion unfortunately happened on February 24th, no time was wasted on actually working on putting the sanctions together and coalition together, because everything was ready, was just put right in place the moment Russian tanks moved into Ukraine. and then the whole logic we can argue and will still be debated in the coming years. The logic of non-escalation by Washington, was it flawed or was it a reasonable one? Was it expecting that not to provoke Russia, not to escalate, maybe be careful and watch out what you're doing? For instance, interrupting the supply of weapons to Ukraine for quite a few days immediately prior to February 24th. Was it the right decision or not? Because you can, on both escalation and non-escalation, it could be different approaches. Like, what do? You be being careful, you watch your steps, you watch your rhetorics, you give opponent counterpart some space, or you're actually being more prudent and more aggressive in many ways, or putting bully in his place. What do you do? I mean, both of those modes of behavior, they can produce some escalation or de-escalation, and you never know. And now we know that there were many other areas where two sides work together. It was an excellent article, very new information revealed there. I haven't seen it before. Another day by David Ignatius in New York Times, I think, on cyber defense, like two sides work together to prevent major cyber attacks by Russians against Ukraine since February 24th. Before that, and since February 24th, and I can tell you, we were really surprised here in Ukraine. We didn't have any major cyber attacks, successful cyber attacks, but not for the lack of trying. It turns out that two sides were working together, and the special office, on cybersecurity was working with our leaders, and also the big companies and corporations like Microsoft, like Google. They were spending time and money. Like Google spent something like $300 million, they say, now on helping Ukrainians to withstand the cyber attacks from Russia. So ever since February 24th, it's a different ball game, obviously, here for us in Ukraine and for our relations. It's a major test of our bilateral relations. That's exactly the times right now, like you have now here in Ukraine, with this war ongoing, and when you see who is your friend and who is not, and what the friends are for, and how they can help you in times of need. And that's a desperate need of Ukraine, obviously. All focus on the weapons now for obvious reasons. I mean, don't judge Ukrainians harshly. They're forgetting about some other things that Americans are doing now for my country. The focus is on weapons. The focus is on the front line, on the war news. We've been tuned into the news from the front, and that's a big front. It's been just mentioned the other day that it's 2,500 kilometers. Front line. So I'm sorry about operating in kilometers now, so it's different in miles, obviously, but you can do the math, and that's a huge front that Ukrainians need to keep with Russians, and obviously we need weapons. And the situation in some areas like Donbass now, for instance, is more dramatic, and we're incurring losses on our side, terrible losses, and we need weapons badly, and we're outgunned in without quotation marks and with quotation marks as well. It seems now obvious that no one was quite ready, not here, not in Ukraine, not in US, but definitely not in Europe, for this war, the war of the scale and this intensity. Not even the Pentagon, it seems, because the scale of what you need to give to Ukraine to continue to be in a fight. Surprise Pentagon, you see this storages now empty of javelins and stingers, and various orders put by this administration for the military industrial complex now to quickly produce more, because Ukrainians need more. I mean, definitely this war was something not expected and definitely not seen of this scale before, so no one was quite understanding what it might be requiring. And even though the Pentagon was preparing, now we know more, planning for months, what could be done, what could be the routes and corridors for infrastructure, for transportation of those weapons into Ukraine, for instance, across Western border, because everyone understood that that would be the primary, direction to bring stuff into Ukraine, and also stuff from outside of Ukraine to the Western markets, and people, refugees as well. The numerical financial side of this assistance is staggering now. I mean, for years, actually, Ukrainians were complaining about Afghanistan, for instance, and saying, well, Afghanistan is getting billions from US, and we're only getting like 250 millions, for instance. And now we're getting tens of billions, right? But another thing that Ukrainians often wonder aloud, like why we were not giving some of it before, so for us to be better prepared for this invasion. But then again, we go back to this subject of escalation or non-escalation on the American side, and the reason for what a lot of timidness maybe on the American side in the previous years was not to provoke Russia to do more aggressive moves, exactly of the type that they are doing right now, unfortunately. So what is really matters now for Ukrainians is, is like not just the numbers, because of course it's been 7 billion just for security assistance, direct assistance, including the 450 million just announced yesterday, I believe. And the bigger number is 53 billion. But what are we getting? What weapons? When? How many? And sometimes it seems that we can, only get something tomorrow what we need badly yesterday. So that's an assessment which is made on a regular basis. And of course, it's coordination mechanism there. I think the other day, the American representative to NATO, Julian Smith, mentioned that there are lists from Ukraine that are being updated, or basically on a daily basis are shifting what Ukraine needs now, what Ukraine needs more tomorrow, or something like that. So it's not easy task, I think, for Americans even to come up with that assistance sometimes, because Ukrainians might call for other different things in different times of this war. The humanitarian assistance is here. Of course, Americans are now picking up their part of the deal with refugees. I think when Biden was here, it was announced that this 1 billion will go into this. But I'm hearing also that many questions remain on the refugee situation in terms of Americans receiving Ukrainian refugees in the US. Some issues are not solved, the formal, bureaucratic issues, but the whole politicization of the refugees and immigration, sphere in American politics is also to blame, because this time around you probably want to have this 100,000, I think it was announced, Ukrainian refugees in the US, but to provide enough of the formalities for them to come in easier, it's not that easy sometimes. Also, there are funds to prop up the economy for now, at least, to keep it afloat, involved in getting what Ukraine needs badly as well, like fuel now, for instance, because we're badly out of fuel. Obviously, our oil refineries have been bombed here, and basically we don't have our capacity to refine fuel anymore. So we need more of that coming, and Americans are taking part in these activities as well. In terms of economy, I mean, they're trying to keep our economy afloat, and surprisingly, it's working. I mean, I'm getting my salary from my university so far. I mean, I'm my banking cards are working. A lot of people are still surprised that after 4 months of this terrible war, the banking system is working. But partially, thanks to the assistance we're getting from our American friends and other friends in this pro-Ukraine coalition. There are now discussions about the grain export. It comes closer to my heart, my hometown of Odessa, which is now blockaded, of course, as all other ports on the Ukrainian Black Sea coast. And it seems there's no other way out of it, even though US administration is proposing different things. Like the other day, President Biden, for instance, he said that the new grain silos should be built quickly on the other side of the border, say in Poland, for Ukrainian grain to come in there. But he couldn't do it quickly enough, and still it wouldn't resolve the whole issue. I mean, not by trucks, not by trains. That would not be a right substitute in numbers in terms of what Ukraine should used to export by ships. There is already beginning to think about the Marshall Plan for Ukraine. I mean, whatever the name might be. I mean, if you use a parallel with Marshall, it could be a Blinken plan, I think. But also, I think it might dwarf that Marshall Plan in terms of numbers of the amounts that Ukraine would need to rebuild its economy after this war is over. And also, I think Americans and other allies would definitely help Ukraine, would need to help Ukraine, I hope, to deal with the enormous debt that we are now accumulating as a country, because we're receiving a lot of this assistance, but some of it needs to be paid back. So finally, I would like to say, before we open up for questions, that there's still some nervousness in the air here and there in bilateral relations, even though most of it is working really well. I mean, look at the military cooperation, look at the sharing intelligence and other things. But for instance, there is some exchange of accusations as to who did what prior to February 24th. I should say it's not helpful, not from Ukrainian side, not from American side. I frankly regretted hearing President Biden the other day saying something along those lines, like, we told Ukrainians they didn't listen. Ukrainians say, of course, we did listen. We just didn't, put it up for a show. We've been preparing and so on. So this kind of exchange of blames can be left for after the war, maybe. Definitely not the right time right now. Not to damage the chemistry in bilateral relations. And finally, is this administration, American administration, is seeing clearly a strategy of helping Ukraine in this war, or is it more of an ad hoc reaction to what's happening on a battleground, a front line? This question is lingering out there for me, at least. I see it this way. There have been already several clear stages. First, early on, of course, everyone expected Ukraine to lose quickly and badly. It didn't happen. Then there was some kind of a period when almost a euphoria was like, and I remember Secretaries Blinken and Austin coming out and saying Ukraine is winning, Russia is losing, getting defeated, and should be weakened, and so on. Now, of course, a different situation in Donbass for the last month or so, and people say, oh, Ukraine is losing, so maybe we should kind of push it very gently towards a peace deal with Russia right now before it lost. But it happens in the bigger wars and longer wars, and this one, unfortunately, shaping out to be a bigger, longer war. Ups and downs. One moment Ukrainian troops are on the offensive, other time they were in defensive. So you shouldn't, I think, if you're American administration, base your assumptions in your strategy and seeing a strategy with this war and helping Ukraine on what happens on the front line last night or last week or so. You need to see have more of this front-based kind of a strategic vision understanding. Much, of course, in the prospects of our relations will depend on the outcome of the war. I think there's no doubt that there will be important relations for both sides. Definitely here for Ukraine, a key relationship is dealing with the US, helping restore our economy, maybe helping Ukraine to become even more mature and resilient in terms of further acts of aggression on the Russian part. And I think there will be, after this war is over, we're already seeing, foreseeing more acts of aggression in the future. So we'll see what happens. If this idea that Zelensky's team had for a while, that Americans can have some kind of a new, more viable and effective guarantees comparing to the assurances of the Budapest memorandum type, in the future, maybe helping Ukraine to deal with the security, arrange Ukrainian security in a more viable way. Would that be happening or not? But I'm sure that either way, we are looking into the months and years and frankly, decades of these two countries working together, but under difficult circumstances, clearly here in Ukraine. But let me conclude by saying that people like myself, many other Ukrainians, we are deeply appreciative of what Americans are doing as a country, as a government, as a non-government sector as well, as just a broad public in helping Ukraine to deal with this very difficult times that we're having now here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Volodymyr. A reminder, if you have a question for our speaker today, you should use the Q&A feature in Zoom rather than raising your hand, and we will be monitoring the Q&A throughout the discussion. So my first question is, you mentioned a little bit about post-war, and obviously that is a long way away right now. And you talked about Marshall plans, reconstructions, and so forth. My question is, what has to happen for 8 million plus refugees to return to Ukraine? That's the human capital that Ukraine needs to be a productive, viable state. And perhaps, the longer the war drags on, the less interested the people who are abroad will be to return. So what is necessary to make sure that these refugees return to Ukraine?
It's a great question. Obviously, you would understand that this is a really haunting question for all of us. Not only we're talking about refugees, but also about the IDPs. I finally understand this word better than comparing to the times when I was seeing IDPs in other countries, but now we're full of IDPs here in Ukraine. About 1/3 of the population, just to give a number, for those maybe who are not following the numbers in our audience, have left their homes, have been uprooted by the war, and quickly. I mean, so not only it's unprecedented in numbers, it's about 15 million people altogether, IDPs and refugees, but also it happened within like 2 to 3 weeks. I mean, nothing of that sort happened ever anywhere else, you know. So we can compare like humanitarian crisis here in Ukraine to various other places around the globe, like Rohingya, I don't know, Yemen, or I don't know, Rwanda or something like that, or Ethiopia, but maybe not that many and definitely not that quickly. So yeah, it's a big question. I mean, the people would need to know if they're safe to return, first of all, not shelling, there's no missiles flying. If they have their apartment buildings or whatever houses they used to live in, are they intact? Can they actually return? Is there infrastructure? You know, is there electricity? Is there water supply? Is there things like that? So the kindergarten, you know, that my kid went to, I mean, not my, I don't have kids, but other people's kids went to, or schools. Do I have a work? I mean, there's a plant or factory still standing where I had to work. And those are big questions. And many of those questions, unfortunately, the answer is, I don't know or no, because maybe a lot of people are left without jobs. Businesses basically stalled here in Ukraine. That's a big issue. And of course, you know, frankly, a lot of people, yes, you're right, they will be looking for their future outside of Ukraine then and staying outside in Europe, especially considering that there is so much hospitality being shown to Ukrainians in Europe and elsewhere. And also considering that some of those countries actually need some qualified and labor force, you know, and here you come, Ukrainians, and they might take some of those jobs positions in various countries and the economies of those countries, contributing them, but not Ukraine. So I think it would depend on what the government, I mean, when the war ends, where it ends, what conditions, but also what Ukrainian government does and what our friends outside will do to help Ukraine and how quickly that can be done. Because right now, obviously, it's a big question mark. I mean, I'm not prepared to say what, you know, percentage of the people would return or not. Some are returning already, actually. The number that you provided, it's probably the total number of people who crossed outside out of Ukraine into Europe, for instance, but some people came back already because also the life of a refugee can be sometimes tough. Or, for instance, their hometown is more safer now, like Kyiv, which is a big population center. And obviously, in the first several weeks, it wasn't safe there, but ever since then, people were kind of returning to Kyiv. There are no big missile attacks on Kyiv, or very infrequent, so to speak. So it's not a normal life, obviously, but it's relatively reasonably safe to return to Kyiv, for instance, but definitely not to Kharkiv, and there's no Mariupol, and definitely not to Mykolaiv, for instance, a big neighbor of Odessa. And even in Odessa, just 2 days ago, we had 14 missile strikes at the Odessa region. So it's not good. I mean, so obviously it's a big question mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Volodymyr. We're going to go to our questions now. Our first question is from Stanislav Stansky. He asks, could you compare US support with EU support? Is it proportional? And several other people have asked a question about the difference in support between the EU and the United States.
Right. So first of all, as a citizen of Ukraine, a resident of Ukraine, I say we're grateful to everyone who's contributing in any way, you know, and each country finds their own way. Some sends weapons, others sends financial assistance. For instance, Germany is kind of slow on sending weapons, especially heavy weapons. And unfortunately, Chancellor Scholz often promises Ukraine that he will send some weapons, and then he kind of backtracks on this. And a lot of people, not just in Ukraine, but in Germany itself, are wondering, like, why would you promise that you would give to Ukraine some weapons and then delay the delivery, something like that. But Germany at the same time, for instance, is a key supporter of Ukraine in terms of humanitarian assistance, and they're taking care of a lot of refugees too. I mean, obviously not the numbers that Poland is dealing with, and we're eternally grateful to our Polish friends, but still a big number there in Germany as well. So Germany is clearly will be a major player also in a post-war reconstruction of Ukraine, undoubtedly, and they told us this several times already. So, and we have reasons to believe them. So, I mean, every country is helping in their own way. In terms of security assistance, of course, US is well ahead of other countries in terms of numbers. In terms of financial or humanitarian assistance, I think other countries, if you take them together here in Europe, I mean, they would probably outdo US. But right now, frankly, we need both. I mean, it's hard to choose. We're not choosing. I mean, we need weapons, but we also need humanitarian assistance. So I think it's comparable numbers here, really, in terms of helping Ukraine. And again, each country chooses. I wouldn't say sometimes it's EU money, sometimes it's particular country's money. Same thing with NATO, by the way. Sometimes it's alliance formulating its policy on helping Ukraine, and sometimes particular member states decide for themselves, as they are allowed by all of these documents, Washington Treaty, and so on, to decide for themselves how they want to help Ukraine. Some send heavy weapons, some send something else. So, yeah, comparable numbers, big numbers, probably still not enough, considering the scale of this challenge that we're dealing with.
Thank you. The next question is from Charles Burry, and he asks, has even one single NATO tank ever been stationed inside the borders of Ukraine, as Putin claims, i.e., he invaded to stop the so-called NATO threat to Russia? So is there really a NATO threat in terms of Ukraine's potential application to join NATO, or is that something that Putin essentially invented?
I think he's invented it, but I mean, if they ever constructed for themselves this fear, this kind of a ghost of NATO threat, that's their problem. I mean, it's not NATO's problem. NATO was very careful in terms of suggesting to Russia to work together, starting from the 1997 charter, all the way then to working with NATO in many various other, fields. I remember the times when the number of joint exercises, military exercises by Russia and NATO outnumber those between NATO and Ukraine many times. So there were times, and then all of a sudden they decided to turn around the ship of, of Russian foreign policy, and and they started to depict NATO as a threat. And then NATO, of course, in return of Russia to Russian belligerent behavior, they started to see Russia as a threat. But still, the expansion was never really meant against Russia. And also, we should remember that no one in Washington or Brussels was making these decisions in terms of enlargement. It was more locally driven. A number of countries decided that they wanted to be part of this alliance. And that's why it happened. There was a debate, and then they were invited. And also, following a certain meeting, certain criteria. With Ukraine, we didn't have any clear perspective to become members or even getting closer to membership status in recent years. That's obvious to everyone. Ever since 2008 Bucharest summit, when Ukraine and Georgia were promised membership, but not given membership. And that was a really awkward and bad, frankly, decision, because you kind of antagonized Russia, because Russia said, okay, they promised that Ukraine and Georgia will be members one day. That's not good for us. And at the same time, you didn't give them anything, or not even the membership action plan. So wasn't a very smart decision. And ever since, Ukraine was working with NATO. That's another thing in the recent years, but probably one of the things that triggered Putin, that he didn't want to see Ukraine slipping away from their sphere of interest or control. And when they say in Moscow in the recent months, and even prior to February 24th, that Ukraine is de facto NATO member, what they mean that we have increased the level of our cooperation with NATO. That's true. That's a fact. We got more weapons, we got training programs, and actually scholars debate now how much of a success of Ukrainian military is due to this intensive training programs done by US and other countries here in Ukraine, in terms of even changing the mentality of Ukrainian military from Soviet, frankly, to the new kind of mentality, which encourages lower rank officers to make certain decisions on the battleground at the thick of the moment, which allowed us to beat them near Kyiv and Chernihiv in the first months or so of this war. That was probably also because of this assistance and this training. So yes, we were working with NATO, but we were not getting closer to NATO. And also Zelensky was already recognizing this. And he said, even prior to this invasion, that, okay, if this is a problem, we would make a formal statement that Ukraine is not going to become a formal member of NATO. And that's it. But then Putin decided to act otherwise. He was actually quite successful using soft power with Ukraine for years. But then at a certain point, he decided to switch more to the hard power. And clearly in February 22, forgot about the soft power. There was end of Russian war here in Ukraine after this invasion. I mean, Ukraine is irreversibly lost now as a country to Russia, which could have been friendlier or even friendly to Russia, if you think about it. But then after this invasion, of course not. So not very smart decision. And also if you consider Finland and Sweden maybe joining sometime soon, And if you consider Ukraine and Moldova now getting this candidate status into EU yesterday, and maybe other things, you'll see that Russia would gonna regret that are already byproducts of their aggression against Ukraine.
You raised a good point about soft power and hard power. Why do you think, we've all read Putin's famous speech now just before the invasion, justifying the attack. But why do you think Putin decided that, in fact, soft power wasn't going to solve the situation in Ukraine and he had to invade?
Well,
yes, that's a big mystery, but
yes. There's no definite answer. You're right. I mean, we can only guess. We can have theories, and I think it's a number of factors. I don't think it's just one factor. I think it's a number of factors. One I've described already. Ukraine was kind of slipping away slowly. After all, deciding, that we're going to move westward. And still, on the NATO issue, we had in our constitution, even under the previous president, we have encrusted the priority for us to move towards membership in EU and NATO one day. And working with NATO, working in the Black Sea region as well, by the way. And I don't think he liked it. I don't think he liked this training. I don't think he liked Americans and Brits helping us to build a new military Navy base on the Black Sea. I don't think he liked American spy planes flying here and looking what Russians are doing, sneaking in their, back door and looking at their backyard the way they see it. They called it near abroad for many years, as you know. So for whatever reasons, they always wanted this area for themselves. Ukraine holds a very special place to people like Putin and many Russians in general. Even historically, we might remember that in the second half of 17th century, think about it, it was a time when half of Ukraine got under Russian control, and that exactly was the time when Russia became, from Moscow, state led by Tsar, became Russian Empire, led by Emperor. No coincidence there. So ever since that time, Ukraine is so important, key to Russian identity, seeing themselves. And if they're wanting to become a new empire or a really great power, or maybe superpower again, then Ukraine should be under their control and their thinking. And of course, Putin maybe lost some of this rationality or not, but got too ideologized. I think probably aggravated by COVID's, not talking to people sitting in that bunker for 2 years. That's probably true. Got off the rails to some extent. And writing again things like Ukraine is not existent, there's no such thing as Ukrainian people, and so on, and calling us Nazis. If someone likes Ukraine and wants it to be a free, independent, sovereign country, and such person is a Nazi, then, well, you're dealing with 40+ million Nazis. That's it, And they are already publicly, people like Simonian and others saying, we didn't expect so many Nazis here in Ukraine fighting us here in Ukraine. Regardless of where you're coming from in Ukraine, what's your religion, what's your background, what's your social status, what language are you using, people were coming up to fight this invasion back, and that's really an independence war. We didn't have one back in 91. Our independence in many ways was kind of given to us by the fact that the Soviet Union dissolved. But right now, unfortunately, we're having this delayed independence war. That's what it is.
Our next question comes from Dan Whitman, and he asks, how do you see the academic year of 2022-23 playing out on Ukrainian campuses? Is there any sort of, academic return to academic normalcy, or is that's just not possible during this time of war?
Very painful question, personal and close to heart. And I know Dan actually gave a guest lecture for my students for one of my courses several months ago, early in this war. There is no return to normalcy whatsoever. The budget is empty. Whatever positions that were funded through the Ministry of Education, there will be a problem there. But with all positions that were funded through students paying tuition here, there will be always also a problem, because some students have left and they're already studying abroad, and some of them will continue to study abroad. And some faculty members have left, females, my female colleagues, because for men like myself, we could not leave now because of martial law. Any man between ages of 18 and 60, we couldn't leave. I'm 52, for instance, I couldn't leave. And that's fine. I'm working here in Ukraine, but that's just the reality. And some have left. And again, I think some of them have been offered very kind, nice positions here and there in Europe or elsewhere, and some might not return or not return immediately. So this all, but above all, the economic situation which has been discussed already. I mean, if you don't have a business, how are you going to pay for your education? And the amount of tuition, average tuition pay here obviously is much lower than in many American universities, but still, it's a lot of money to a lot of people. So if your parents, for instance, the parents here tend to pay for their kids' education here in this country, don't have a business, all right, running, don't have any income, any earnings, like how they can pay for your education, or even you cannot stay in your house, or even mention that there's above 100 education institutions here in Ukraine that are completely destroyed. Several universities, big university in Mariupol is gone. There's several main buildings of Kharkiv Karazin University destroyed, and they would not be restored or repaired anytime soon. And a similar situation in many other places. The Sumy University was shelled, the university in Chernihiv was damaged, and many others. So it's very difficult, very difficult. I mean, we're only thinking now about surviving, frankly. Many positions will be cut, many salaries will be cut in times when you have this hyperinflation. So you would have people like myself and my colleagues, faculty members here, actually maybe getting even less money. For instance, my salary here of associate professor, PhD, also director of a small think tank, is something around $500 US a month. With inflated prices here, you can hardly live off it. And also, very frankly, personally, I don't, for instance, have immediate family like wife and kids, but many of my colleagues do, and they need to feed their families. So it's a very complicated. And excuse me if I spend too much time talking about it, but it comes close to heart. It's a complicated issue. That's just in my field, but in many other spheres, unfortunately, it's going to be hard looking forward, even when the war is over. But hopefully it will be over sooner the better.
Which leads to our next question from John Woodworth. What circumstances would allow Ukraine to seek to open negotiations with Russia to bring the war to an end?
I think the cessation of open hostilities would be one, when they stop firing, the Russians stop firing, and that would be it. But also both sides probably have not reached their optimal, in their views, negotiating positions. I mean, Russians think still that they might mobilize more forces here and there and, reach more towns and occupy more lands here in Ukraine and not allow Ukrainians to recapture some of the lands we've lost early on after February 24th. Ukraine is still hopeful that we might do exactly that, that we actually can turn the tide and we can turn the tables on them and recapture initiative and go on counteroffensive in various places. After all, it was possible near Kyiv and Chernihiv, and early on near Kharkiv. Is more complicated now near Kharkiv. Russians are trying to reclaim some of the land they lost several weeks ago. But also in the south, it's very important for us in the south. I mean, for people like myself from Odessa, I mean, what happens in the Mykolaiv region and Kherson and Zaporizhia region. There've been some signs of Ukrainian troops slowly kind of capturing village town by town, but also I'm hearing Russians are bringing some fresh troops here. So there'll be big fighting. But the thing, let me tell you, the thing that Russians are now announcing more and more measures on securing Crimea and defending Crimea is kind of telling. From their plan early in the war, you know what I mean? Yeah, I can see that you do. And early on in the war, they wanted the entire Ukraine under their occupation or under their control with puppet regime or something. Zelensky fleeing, being deposed, and doing all of it within a week or so. And now after 4 months of war, what they're doing, they're protecting Crimea. And not that Ukraine is planning to attack Crimea anytime soon, but they're already thinking about that. So that tells you they're not very confident either. And it could all go by either ways. It's still a little bit of a swing in this war. And it could be, like I said, ups and downs for both countries. And that is why neither Moscow or Kyiv are prepared to sit down for negotiations. There is major appetite here in Ukraine for negotiations and a peace deal, but not at any means, not at any price. I mean, if you look at the sociological polls, people are not ready here in Ukraine, even in the regions that suffer from bombing and shelling. Even those regions, they're not ready for concessions, in territories towards Russia. So And therefore, Putin thinks probably that he is capable of doing more. And again, here is the question of is he getting a proper information about what's happening on the battleground? That's another thing, but probably he is still hopeful. So yeah, in the coming weeks and months, I don't expect any sitting down for real, for serious, whether both sides would be actually talking about peace. There was an interesting moment there in Istanbul some time ago with negotiations, and Ukraine's position was kind of flexible and soft. Russia didn't recognize this moment. They wanted more war. Okay, fine. Actually, Ukraine's position got hardened ever since that time because we actually liberated some land, and we discovered war crimes in Bucha and many other Buchas. All right, and that definitely changed the whole narrative in the country. A lot of people here say we shouldn't even talk to those Russians. I mean, we should only try to defeat them, and that's it, and that would be our peace deal. So we'll see. I think there is more war coming, unfortunately.
Thanks. Our next question is from Elisa Goldberg, who's said that you've already talked about the gendered impacts of Russia's invasion of the war with requirements for male service and keeping men in Ukraine. How do you think that the U.S. should incorporate these gendered realities into their response and support to Ukraine and displaced Ukrainians?
It's a great question. I mean, off the top of my head, I would even struggle to get an answer, an idea what the answer should be. But let's see. I think first of all, there is a need to acknowledge that there is a huge issue with IDPs here. Early on in the war, clearly, I didn't see anyone in the West seeing those IDPs behind the refugees, because you had such a massive outflow of refugees into Europe or elsewhere, that the people focused immediately on helping them for the right reason. But then there's even more IDPs here who could be, frankly, in a worse situation than refugees. Because if you're a refugee, you come to a certain country, you're getting some support, you have a network of support, you have some money normally paid by the country, the government of the country which is hosting you, or even the local government in many cases. They provided housing and stuff. I'm hearing from many of my friends who happen to be refugees now. But if you're IDP, you're not really getting much of support. I mean, you basically depend on what you've earned, what you brought with you, your savings. And sometimes you're happy with finding some opportunity to find a housing for free or for a small amount of money, but other times, no. And again, you need to work, you need to pay for education, you need to pay for food. And if your business back home is damaged or destroyed, how can you do that? So I think there should be more recognition that the IDP situation is desperate and getting dire, because this war is getting longer. I mean, early on, some people maybe thought, okay, we'll probably have the months of the scale of hostilities, but now it's 4 months. So I think in that respect, there should be this understanding that Ukraine has many problems on our hands, and there should be some thinking outside the box of how can you help those IDPs directly, maybe. I mean, one way, of course, to do it through Ukrainian government, but okay, some people might distrust Ukrainian government. It has a reputation of being corrupt. Actually, I should say Ukrainian government is doing really well in this recent 4 months. Surprisingly, I keep saying to people when I talk about it, this subject in recent months, that I think the Ukrainian government is more proficient and more professional and effective than it was before the war started. People showing to work, trains run on service, on timetables and so on. Ukraine is anything but the failed state. I mean, it's a very resilient state. I mean, it's actually something contrary to the failed state. And this is due to what Ukrainians are putting up as their resistance to Russian invasion. But yes, we need help, and including people who are IDPs, yes.
Thank you, Volodymyr. Our next question is from Peter Prayer, and he asks, is the disproportionate impact of the Russian invasion likely to aggravate regional tensions post-war?
That's a great question. It's a wonderful audience, I can tell you. I mean, yeah, I've been doing similar talks basically on a daily basis in the last 4 months, but some of the best questions I'm getting tonight, actually. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there might be some tension. There is some even now, frankly. I mean, for instance, I am myself an IDP. I'm outside of my hometown of Odessa now, away from those missiles flying. And I also had to bring my old, senior mother away from this situation with me to Western Ukraine. And it's half of Ukraine. Seems like half of Ukraine is here in Western Ukraine. I mean, and it's a tension. I mean, it's a shortage of kindergartens, schools, definitely of jobs. I mean, the Western Ukraine wasn't necessarily the most economically advanced part of Ukraine to start with, and now all of a sudden you have this influx of millions of people coming and looking for work. So it's setting some tensions, and also, you know, in terms of people like myself, men, being away from frontline, and some of the people from this lands going to frontline to fight. And then there's some people, locals, asking this question like, why are we having this, you know, IDPs, this internal refugees here at the time when, say, many people, locals who I know, are actually going to frontline and dying there. So there might be some grievances, and maybe later on, when the amount of financial assistance coming to Ukraine from outside will be divided between the regions, because as well, people will be asking questions like, obviously, the first vote would be put to help those areas damaged the most serious way, which is east and south. But then again, then central Ukraine and here Western Ukraine would be asking questions, because like, okay, well, why did we pull all this effort to help the rest of our country now to be left without any financial assistance, or with very little that financial assistance, because infrastructure is being pummeled everywhere, as you know. I mean, it doesn't matter for a Russian missile, you know, is it Lviv or is it something else? So it's a problem, and yes, there might be some tension. But for now, there is impressive consolidation, amount of coherence among Ukrainians and them coming together, rallying around the flag. With the government, by the way, I mean, one surprising thing, Ukrainians all of a sudden like their government, support their government, and the ratings of president, which was really low before the war, is now in the, you know, up in sky. So this is surprising. It's never happened in 30 plus years of Ukrainian independence that the Ukrainians would be rallying so decisively around the government. But so for now, it's consolidation. But yeah, there might be some little cracks here and there for the coming years. Yes.
So Russia has pretty much announced its intentions, not just to create a frozen conflict, but to annex territory. So what will be the reaction of Ukraine with announcements from Russia that it is going to annex Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and so forth? Will that only convince Ukraine to fight more, or will it be ultimately accepted, as it were, as a casualty of the war?
Well, I have to be frank, you know, because I'm not a government spokesman myself. I'm my own man. I mean, I'm a university professor, so I'm an expert, and I say that first of all, of course, there will be non-recognition, that's for sure. And I don't expect this government even to be recognizing Donbass and even Crimea still in the coming months, being ready to recognize Crimea as a part of Russia, even less so as a part of Zaporizhia or Kherson region, for instance. So yeah, there will be no non-recognition, but of those territorial gains by Russia. But also in terms of them, us being able to liberate those lands, it will depend on the situation on the battleground, on the front line. If we feel confident, if we still have capable forces, you know, battle ready, if we get enough of the weapons supply from the West, you know, we'll probably able to liberate some of those lands. But there is also recognition that will be difficult probably to go beyond restoring our borders to the borders that we had on February 23rd. And Zelensky spoke about it several times already. I think like a month and a half ago, when there was some euphoria and triumphalism in the West and here in Ukraine too, he was saying things like, okay, full complete restoration of Ukrainian territorial integrity. But now he's more speaking about restoring borders like they were on February 23rd. So that's a recognition of hard fact, you know, of what we can do probably in the coming months. It's a very hard war with a very difficult enemy. An asymmetric conflict, because whatever happens to Russian military now, the battleground, they're a very strong enemy. So we'll see. I mean, the trick and the danger also is like Zelensky said today, is very popular. But once he become to produce some concessions, maybe at some certain point, his ratings might actually go down. And Ukraine, unlike Russia, is a democratic country. You have a parliament, you have opposition, you have free media, and they wouldn't waste no time on criticizing Zelensky for doing those concessions. So there is a risk there, that might eat into the consolidation that we have now in this country. But I think it's inevitable. At one point of time, he would sit down and he would do some of those concessions, and we'll have a discussion here in terms of how far we're ready to go.
Our next question comes from Anita Parlow, and she asked a bunch of questions, but I'll only focus on one. And her question is, would it help to have U.S. Navy escort ships for grain export? Is that something that is possible in the near or medium-term future?
I think it would definitely help, but I don't think it's going to happen. And I have to be realistic. I understand that the highest priority, the imperative really for the West, including US and primarily US maybe even, is not to be in a situation when you can start a direct confrontation with Russia, military confrontation with Russia. It's going to be risky. It's going to be risky for everyone. It's going to, could it lead to a nuclear escalation too? Maybe not. Maybe it's just more of intimidation by Russia, what they're talking about, this nuclear weapons all the time. But it's risky. It's going to be difficult, and therefore they would avoid this. And if the open sky idea was refused and other things, similar ideas that would require Western troops to come into Ukraine, then Navy convoys would probably be decided against as well, because it's a bad idea to have American or any NATO, frankly, battleships next to the Russian battleships there. Not that Russia is getting much of fruits or benefit out of their total domination vis-a-vis Ukraine and on the naval front, surprisingly little, frankly, and already having some losses against the country which basically doesn't have a navy. But, well, they do have those battleships, and the risk of escalation would be too big if you have navy convoys. We would love to see it, but probably not going to happen, and that's my position. Oh. I don't know. Okay. I lost.
We lost you, but
oh, okay.
That only gives me that will allow me just to ask one more question, because
Sure.
you answered so many questions here and
right.
Very responsive. So what are the threats of escalation? Obviously the conflict has been focused in Eastern Ukraine, but there was the incident 2 days ago in Lithuania.
Mm-hmm.
There's been drone strikes against refineries in Russia. To what extent is there a risk of this getting far more problematic for the West and for a greater escalation of the war?
Sure. Well, in terms of strikes against Russian refinery, for instance, similar cases in the prior weeks, it's a Ukraine-Russia war. Russia-Ukraine war doesn't matter, so we can strike them back. I mean, there's now understanding that we are allowed to do that under international law. Clearly, we've been given already some consultations by a lot of powers and authorities on this, and including the military commanders of US, UK, some other countries. They recognize that if Russian military is striking us, including Russian artillery striking, across the borders right now into Sumy, Chernihiv region, so why wouldn't Ukraine being defensive, not planning to occupy Russian land, but being defensive, and make some strikes against their infrastructure on oil refinery, not just military targets, but also oil refinery, to undermine their military machine. In terms of it getting out of the framework of the Russia-Ukraine confrontation, I don't think that there is a big risk of escalation. There is a certain risk of escalation, but frankly, look, Ukraine took Russian military to a serious task here. We bloodied their nose. They didn't expect this. They are diminished in some ways. They're weakened. That's a fact. When some of them are threatening now other countries, in many ways it's hollow threat, because Ukraine has took a major blow for the rest of Europe, or Western civilization for that matter. And now we've been talking about for years actually about us standing as a forepost, as a front bastion on the way of Russian aggression into Europe. A lot of people in the West were just smiling that what was this Ukraine is talking about. Look what's happening in this recent 4 months. That's exactly what Ukraine is doing. So whatever forces or capabilities the Russians had Now to use them on Baltics, I don't know, or Finland or Romania or Poland, you know, there is much less, substantially less of those capabilities now because of what Ukrainian troops have done to them in recent 4 months. So therefore, I don't think that there is high risk of escalation. But of course, if cornered, they can actually look for a strike against a NATO country, for instance, to justify even a bigger war, a great patriotic war too, you know, when they would mobilize in Russia and they would actually maybe declare martial law there. It might be, there is a certain risk that Putin might go that way.
Well, thank you, Volodymyr, very much for all your answers and for your discussion. I also want to add to Volodymyr's comment that the questions were excellent, and thank our audience for sparking the conversation even further. I thank everyone for joining us today and look forward to everyone joining us for future Kennan Institute events. Thanks, Volodymyr, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.